Hello. In the first of these presentations I'm talking about the Gowers review of intellectual property. In the second of the presentations I'll concentrate on the copyright aspects of the Gowers review, which is probably the largest part of it, but in this one I'm going to talk about all the other things that you'll find in the review's report. The review was commissioned by the Treasury back in 2005, and Mr. Gowers, who was a former editor of the Financial Times, was given 12 months in which to come up with a report on the intellectual property system. In order to get underway, he asked a lot of questions of people who were interested in the intellectual property system and received way over 200 submissions in response to that from a wide variety of people, right from the Association of Blacksmiths through to Pink Floyd, who all had some axe to grind about the intellectual property system, or at least a small part of it. As a result of that, the review doesn't cover the entire intellectual property system, but you wouldn't expect it to. You'd only expect it to look at those areas where attention was required, and the one way of identifying where attention is required is to ask the community that uses the intellectual property system what they think needs to be looked at. So it makes sense that the review should have focused on those areas where there was a strength of feeling that there should be some change. How important those changes are and whether that means that the review has omitted some subjects that perhaps it should have looked at in more detail is a moot point. And it may be that the review isn't quite as valuable as it might have been because it hasn't roved over the entire intellectual property landscape, but nevertheless it serves to show those areas where intellectual property law needs to be changed and where we can expect things to happen over the next few years. It set the agenda for the intellectual property world for some considerable time to come, probably. That's not to say that other things won't crop up during that period of time demanding attention, but at least the Gowers Review has identified the important things that the government can focus its attention on. And of course its recommendations are addressed to the government. There are some 58 recommendations altogether in the review's report. The report runs to 150 pages. It's quite a substantial document, and when you think that it was produced in almost exactly a year, it's a pretty impressive work rate to have come up with such a substantial report. Mr. Gowers had a team of 7 civil servants helping him. They did commission independent research from outside bodies on a couple of areas, but even so, for a team of that size to produce the amount of material that they've done and to review the amount of material that was submitted to them is an impressive achievement. So the 58 recommendations cover a wide variety of different areas of intellectual property law. They omit some altogether, either for constitutional reasons. For example, plant breeders' rights weren't within the scope of the review's remit in the first place because they're a departmental responsibility of DEFRA, and therefore they couldn't be brought within the scope of the review. But there are other areas which are largely ignored simply because there wasn't much to be said about them, or people didn't raise points. There's virtually nothing about design protection. There's very little about trademarks. Most of the stuff that you'll find in the review is to do with patents or copyright, or it's to do with governance of the intellectual property system or some other non-substantive area of intellectual property concern. So the 58 recommendations come in a variety of different forms. Some of them are matters that the government can act directly on. Some of them are matters that will require legislation. Usually that legislation will have to go through the European Community or some other international process rather than being something that the government can legislate on directly. Other things are administrative things. They're suggestions about the direction that government policy might take, and they're things that can be changed without having to go to Parliament to get new legislation passed. So the 58 recommendations exist at a variety of different levels in terms of what's needed to be done to comply with what the report suggests. The review starts off with some fairly novel ideas about what the intellectual property system is all about. It attaches importance to taking a holistic view of the intellectual property system, and for practitioners that might be a difficult thing to grasp. We're all accustomed to dealing not just with intellectual property as a single whole, but to looking at trademarks and copyright and patents and so on as separate items. And we know that intellectual property is little more than a convenient shorthand term, legally speaking, to link together those subjects which have got a lot of things in common, but even more things not in common, even more things that distinguish them and keep them apart. So looking at the intellectual property system as a single whole is not always particularly helpful.